I am so conservative.
rationalize in my head. These are things I read in
And
the
I'm going to talk
scripture.
about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
I
invited.
remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. I am so conservative.
And yes, indeed, I am so conservative that I can't even turn left when I'm driving. Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. And this is a trigger warning for those who are new to the webcast. They should be aware this is not a safe space for those who may be easily offended by having their ideas challenged or maybe even by our satire. Today is November 5, 2019, and this is broadcast number 165. This week, Dr. Lyle Story joins us to talk about his book, Joyous Encounters, Discovering the Happy Affections in Luke Acts. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which is the producer of the Unknown Webcast, and our senior, not our senior, as actually how you read it,
researcher.
is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Yes, greetings from sunny Florida, but hey, it's getting nice out. The humidity's leaving, and while all you people shiver up north, yeah, I just want to thank you because every time it goes colder down there, it gets more temperate down here. We are in the place where the palm trees came out, saw their shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. And our sponsors for this program include the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience, the Bible Buffet, and the Coexist Boutique for when you care enough to take your hands off your loved one's throats long enough to pick out the perfect gift. The Bible, the Coexist Boutique. There you go. And if you like this program, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it upon others, to ensure your continued access, please go to MidwestOutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. And every once in a while I lose my cursor, and that doesn't make me curse. But anyway,
but that is a curse that you have.
It's a curse. It's a curse. It's not a blessing. So, in a few more weeks, I'm hoping to have a 3-monitor setup where doing the commercials will be a lot easier. Just screen sharing in general for anything will be a lot easier. Because when you really need, it helps to have 2 monitors just to do the sharing, and then I want to keep my good eye on you though, Don, because you never know what you might be up to.
Well, that'll help you to monitor me. That's exactly right, because you never know. I never know what I'm going to do either. So
I know what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to screen share again because our guest is Dr. Lyle Story, and he has written and J. Lyle Story. We didn't ask did we ask what the J stood for last time you were on?
No, it stands for John.
John Lyle Story. So, and you wrote a book which is available on Amazon and I'm sure other places, called Joyous Encounters, Discovering the Happy Affections in Luke Acts. So this is sort of a thematic, a commentary, and it is a substantial work. I mean, it is 334 pages long, 335 with the select bibliography. It's not a small work, and it focuses in on one particular theme in Luke and Acts. And our listeners should know that Luke and Acts are very often treated as a single work or companion works at the very least, because it is assumed that they were often published together. they often came as a single unit. In the early church, you might not have had a complete New Testament in one bound volume, but you would have had Paul's epistles, perhaps the Gospels, and then you or perhaps Matthew, Mark, and John. And then together you would have had Luke, Acts in very many cases. And so it's fitting that there would be a commentary, since they both came out on the same author, from the same author, that there would be commentaries that combined them. Usually, though, it's too much. I mean, a commentary on Luke and a commentary on Acts, each of those would be very big books, and you'd want to separate them. But in this case, you can fit it into a volume about this size because you've chosen to zoom in on one particular aspect. And that's what we're here to discuss.
It is.
How long have you been working on this, Dr. Story?
Well, I don't know. It's like a 4 to 5 year project.
Okay. And what inspired you to choose this as your theme or as your focus?
Well, I've been long concerned that the Western Church has a tendency to zero in on propositional truth and not take seriously the narratives that are there, and particularly the emotions that are there in biblical texts. And so that's been a major concern of mine.
Yeah.
People tend to favor more propositional theology than center in on the important topic of human emotions. And I did this with Luke and Acts because there's such a preponderance of the joy vocabulary.
So I did find that in your book. I just have a quote here, Don, I was going to share. Is that okay? Hello, Don? Right there. Can you hear me? Your mic's off.
I can hear you fine. I was just trying to figure out where I was in life.
Oh, you're just fine. You're finding your place.
I'm in search of myself. Yeah.
Trying to find yourself. What you just said is almost word for word what I found on page 4. In contrast to many scholars who devalue emotion in biblical texts, I suggest that joy is an emotion of elation over something good that has happened, is occurring, or will take place. In this study, joy is a vital part of various charismatic experiences. As an emotion, joy has an object that is felt for a positive reason, deemed so by a person. But especially that first line, you find not just in the Western Church in general, but among scholars in particular,
Yes,
that they devalue emotion in biblical texts. So,
certainly.
yeah. And what that made me think about was Jonathan Edwards put out a book called A Treatise on Religious Affections.
Yeah,
And he had to defend the place of emotion in religion, in the practice of the faith, not just in the biblical text, but he had to defend the idea that it's okay for Christians to, in worship and in their everyday lives, to express emotion. Religious affection back then meant emotion. I saw a parallel there between this book and Jonathan Edwards. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that God is a God of great joy who wills joy for the people of God. And to be sure, emotions can be of joy can be expressed for the wrong reasons. For example, the joy of the religious leaders when they make a pact with Judas to betray Jesus for a certain amount of money. Well, clearly, that's an emotion for the wrong reason. But what Luke accentuates is that God is a God of great joy who wills joy for the people of God. In essence, to really be arguing for a lived theology of joy. we live within our emotions. And as such, those emotions need to be taken seriously. For example, I think of the poets in the Old Testament and the extreme range of emotions that the poets, particularly of the book of Psalms, express.
Yeah.
And that is a vital part of who we are. And they are not to be devalued.
And I'm glad you mentioned the whole idea of range because lately a lot of my thoughts have been attracted to Psalms like the ones that begin, "Why are you cast down, O my soul?" Psalms that emphasize the opposite of joy. I think those are important because they legitimize, in my mind, they legitimize this experience. I mean, a lot of times, if Christians are depressed, if they're struggling, other believers, well-meaning believers, will say to them, "Okay, you shouldn't be like that. You should be happy. You should always be rejoicing in the Lord."
Yeah.
And of course, that is what we'd all like to be, but it's a reality that there will be legitimate times when we won't be. We'll be the
Yes.
opposite of that. But at the same time, if you focus so much on that, and I've known Christians that do focus on the downside, that they forget about the fact that, well, I'm looking at a search on the word joy in the book of Psalms, and you might think that's the only word it ever uses. It occurs so many times, all the way through from the beginning all the way to the end. Shouts of joy, joy of my heart. Let me hear joy and gladness. Even when David is repenting of his sin, he's saying, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation." So
Yeah.
joy is very
Now,
important.
I have a question for you two. Since you like to deal with the original languages, and I'm a novice at that, under the tutelage of Dr. Story. In fact, for those who are interested, I don't know if we still have a discount going, but if you go to greek2me.biz, you can sign up and take his course on New Testament Greek. But so my question is this: we're talking about joy, and we're talking about range of emotions. All of us have different personality makeups, and so we experience different emotions in different kinds of ways. Is there a difference, though, between joy and happiness?
Well, that's one of the issues that I took on early in the first chapter. So often, people, including scholars, draw some kind of distinction between an inner joy and an external happiness and devalue external happiness. Well, when we work with the Bible makes no such distinction between the two.
Right.
Joy is joy, and it is felt for a positive reason.
Mm-hmm.
At something that has happened, is occurring, or will take place.
Yeah.
So this just doesn't wash. And I was really struck by the number of commentaries and Bible dictionaries that tried to draw some kind of difference between the two, as if internal joy is the thing that is to be sought after, but external happiness is to be negated. The
Yeah.
Bible just doesn't distinguish those.
The there's a point in Philippians. When I also, when I thought about your book, I also thought, how can anybody not see joy as an important theme in the New Testament? He talks about, the reason I'm sharing this with you is so that our joy may be full.
Yes.
And of course, you have Paul, and I wondered, you don't have a scripture index that I could find in the book. But I wondered how many times you referred to the book of Philippians. Did you find yourself referring to that a lot? Because that's the
Not
epistle of
so
joy.
much, because I was limiting my focus to Luke Acts.
Okay.
because of one particular author. I mean, my book could have been 1,000 pages if I got into Paul.
Yeah, the reason I thought of Philippians is because a lot of people are aware of the fact that Paul and Luke had a close acquaintance. They worked closely together, and it's often thought that a lot of what Luke wrote, he wrote at Paul's behest. Of course, he did his own research. But that there was some kind of cross pollination between
Yeah.
the two. And so I often wondered, well, I wonder how much the cross influence is between the writings of Luke and the epistle to the Philippians in particular, which mentions joy so often.
Yes.
And yet in the middle of that, right in the middle of that epistle, Paul talks about how Epaphroditus was sick and near death. And he says in chapter 2, verse 27, "For indeed he was sick to the point of death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, so that I would not have sorrow upon sorrow."
Yes.
And I'm thinking, okay, well, what is that? Sorrow upon sorrow. The only thing I can think of is the fact that Paul was in prison,
Yes.
and that was a sorrowful circumstance for him. And then to have Epaphroditus, was the outside world, die on top of that would have added sorrow to his already existing sorrow. And then he talks about sorrow in the same epistle that he talks about joy and talks about rejoicing in the Lord always.
Yes.
And so it's like I also am dissatisfied with this idea that you can have you have joy on the inside, happiness on the outside, or joy on the inside even when you're having unhappiness on the outside. But I think they're trying to reach for something that's, and perhaps this is it. In my times of sorrow, if I remind myself of certain truths that transcend the temporary sorrow, then I can maybe I can hold on to a bit of joy as I go through the sorrowful times. And when you look at me, you'll see sorrow, but and I will be most on the inside. I'm grieving over whatever it is that I'm grieving over. But if I remind myself in the midst of that sorrow, hey, there's a bigger picture. It can get me through. I don't think we can be joyful and unhappy at the same time in the absolute sense. But I think they're trying with this inadequate formula of unhappy on the outside, joyful on the inside. I think they're trying to get to something that's true. But I agree with you. I don't think it's an adequate way of putting it.
Yeah, it is striking that in the book of Philippians, which, as you mentioned, certainly is a book of great joy, that we also have the fact of Paul's imprisonment, and as you mentioned, the sorrow concerning Epaphroditus. Well, here, Epaphroditus is such an important person in Paul's life that his loss, his death, his premature death, would certainly lead to an experience of sorrow. And that's only to be expected. We are human beings, and when we experience loss of one way, shape, or form, it does lead to sorrow. But that's not the whole picture.
So, which particular author were you responding to? Earlier, you said you were thinking of a particular author.
Well, there are so many Bible dictionaries
Okay.
on the joy vocabulary, and I listed those out, and there I find a very negative response to the topic of joy, particularly with the distinction between internal joy and external happiness. And in many of these, there was actually a pejorative response to joy. And that was really striking to me, as if God is not interested in human emotions. He certainly is.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, it'd be kind of strange if he didn't care whether we rejoiced in our salvation, in his love, and his grace. Yeah.
It's interesting as you're kind of trying to develop this idea, and I have to admit, I have wondered, is there a contrast or a difference between joy and happiness, or joy and whatever? And then as you're talking, I think of James 1:2 that says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." I go,
Yeah.
okay, how does that work? Or James 4:9, "Be wretched and mourn and weep." So you have that emotion going on. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into gloom. So what's going on there? Why is he saying to let your joy, which you're advocating for, be turned into gloom? What is going on there?
Well, for James, he's dealing with the topic of the hiatus in the community between the haves and the have-nots. And so, really, the rich who rejoice in their wealth are doing so at the expense of the impoverished. And so, this is really a sarcastic statement to them. They really should be sorrowful at their treatment
Hmm.
of the people who don't have enough with a hand to mouth existence.
Hmm.
That's the wrong kind of joy to have.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's
Do you think?
sarcastic there.
Well, the so so you think that's a sarcastic verse, "Count it all joy," or is that what you're?
No,
No.
he
No,
says,
no,
count
four
it all
nine.
joy. That's a positive
Oh, that's a
response.
positive. Okay, I was as you were talking, I was looking at this amazing chapter you have in this book, Luke's Joy Vocabulary. It's chapter 2, and it begins with "Words are known by the company they keep." You quote yourself there,
Yes.
uh, and it op- and you give the whole range of vocabulary and give how many times the words are used in different books
Yeah.
of the Bible. And this is an excellent tool if somebody wanted to do their own study and look freshly at all these things. This gives them the starting place. And you know, it reminded me. Okay, first of all, the word for grace, charis,
Yeah.
is directly derived from the word for I rejoice. I am
Yeah.
glad, Cairo. And it's also interesting that um, in both ancient Greek and modern Greek, the word for hello, like today in Greek, it's hierete.
Yeah.
It's related to it's really a way of saying I'm happy to see you.
Yes.
I rejoice in seeing you. Oh how and so it too, the standard greeting comes from Cairo, I rejoice, and so on. Paul switches to grace, and I believe it's because he wants us to rejoice in that.
Yeah. Well, certainly the word grace and joy are linked up sometimes in a word play in the book of Acts.
So, can you give us examples of that?
Uh,
It would be interesting.
Passage where grace is mentioned, and then the next verse will mention joy. And phonetically, both words are almost identical.
Okay,
Charis and chara, joy.
and that would be missed by the reader of the English text.
Yes.
They wouldn't see that.
Yeah.
I'd have to do a search to find it, and my search aptitude in Bible works isn't that great when it comes to putting Greek
Well,
words together.
my search attitude about anything is not all that great.
Are you saying you have a bad attitude? So
Yeah. Ron, you've got a bad attitude.
I do.
you need more joy.
I want to share this momentarily while Ron kind of gets ready to do our next commercial interruption, and that is Lyle Story's book is Joyous Encounters: Discovering Happy Affections in Luke Acts, and also you can go to his website greek2me.biz. and sign up for the program to learn Biblical Greek. And Ron, take it away, baby.
Okay, well, yeah, we've got some questions for you here. Oh, there we are. Okay. Beginning with, are you tired of hearing all about the difference between the milk of the word and the meat of the word? Are you wondering when your church is going to get around to serving the ice cream and cheesecake of the word? Does your pastor take the whole Bible thing way too seriously? Well, then you need to check out the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience. At the Bible Buffet, everything is prepared with your comfort and enjoyment in view. Everything there is gluten-free, trans-fat-free, and truth claim-free. And all of their dishes are piping hot and ready to eat. This week's regular Sunday specials include Aryan appetizers, Sibelian succotash, Galatian goulash, Gnostic nut salad, and Palladian pie. And don't forget, the Bible Buffet is a fully accredited ministry of the Church of Smorgasbordianism. The Bible Buffet, it's not your father's worship experience. Check it out.
Clearly not.
So, here's the thing. In church history and in today, all you got to do is turn on Christian TV, and you see extremism, and you see good things taken to wrong places, emotions. You see there are channels, there's still TV channels that show more traditional church services, and you would think that there's no emotion in the Christian life from some of these. And then you see other programs where you think that's all there is to the Christian life is emotion. So you see two extremes, and so where is the biblical balance?
Well, Ron, let me suggest to you that the Bible as a whole reflects the full panorama of human emotions as they encounter God.
Okay.
And we're talking about the poets of the Psalter. Yes, at times they express extreme despair and raise the agonizing questions, why? Because once the question of why is addressed, meaning can be assigned to suffering. And then they ask the question, how long? Meaning, how long will this experience go on? So that's at one end of the spectrum. And at the other end of the spectrum would be some of your individual songs of praise and joy, as well as community songs of prayer and joy. So in my book, I certainly recognize that joy is not simply the only message of the Bible, but certainly a neglected one.
Yeah.
It is one of many of the fruit of the Spirit that Paul mentions in Galatians 5.
Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because we're an apologetics ministry, and as I see it, what your book got me to thinking about is it's probably clicked in my mind at some point before, but I don't think it crystallized as much as it did when I read your book. The joy is an apologetics tool.
Yes.
I mean, who wants to join a group that is constantly depressed?
Yeah.
I mean, am I going to need antidepressants if I join your religion? If I become a Christian? And sadly, I have known. In fact, I heard just in the last 2 weeks, we had a person in our church a few years ago who was once leading a youth group meeting, and I couldn't. But when I heard this, I just couldn't. I said, "Really? This actually happened?" And he was talking to the young people, and he said, "You just have to resign yourself to the fact that if you're going to live a faithful Christian life, you're not going to have any joy." That's almost a direct quote.
Yeah.
And I said to the fellow I was talking to, I hope you corrected I hope you corrected at least our young people. If you didn't want to embarrass him in front of them, later you brought some correction to that, because frankly, if it weren't for joy, I don't think I would have stayed a Christian for very long. If it weren't for some of the experiences of joy that God gave me early, very early in my Christian life, and like you said, they're not random detached experiences. It's not some kind of airy fairy floating emotion. It's connected to a truth.
Yes.
It's in response to gospel, or in the book, in Luke itself, on the road to Emmaus, they said, did not our hearts burn within us? I mean, they were experiencing something. If it wasn't precisely joy, it created joy in
Yeah.
their hearts to hear what they were hearing. And a lot of times that's those experiences when you sense the truth of the Word of God, and your heart just erupts with joy. Later on down the road you're going to have some hard times, and you're going to need to look back on those and hold on to those. So if you're just telling kids, all you got to look forward to is no joy in your life, I would think they would just bail out on the faith right away.
Yeah, let me suggest to you the mashal of the Good Shepherd in John 10, where Jesus speaks about himself as being the winsome shepherd. That is, there is something about Jesus that is winsome and attractive.
Hmm.
And certainly evangelistic efforts need to tap into this. There is something attractive about the very nature of Christian faith and experience.
Hmm.
Even within Luke, the term repentance doesn't necessarily mean some kind of sorrowful expression at the altar at the end of a worship service. Sometimes it means simply to turn to the new and joyous activity of God
Hmm.
in a positive, inviting manner.
Yeah, well, when he said repent and be baptized, and so on, uh, you don't get the impression that as they went down to be baptized at the end of chapter 2 that they were all weeping and sorrowing.
No.
Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart. Yeah, it's true that they, in some sense, had, especially those who were residents of Jerusalem, had some complicity in the crucifixion of the Messiah. But Paul made it clear, or Peter, I'm sorry, made it clear that even though they with wicked hands crucified him, it was God who, it was according to his predetermined counsel and foreknowledge that this was supposed to happen for their salvation. So that's the joyous part.
Yeah, and in the narrative summaries in the book of Acts, these communities are infused with joy.
Yeah, you always see that.
Yeah, and it's so important.
Yeah, so what I'm concerned about is some. Now, I totally agree. First of all, I think that should be at the forefront of our witness. And probably one of the best ways to put it at the forefront is to, when you're witnessing to occultists or somebody who's trapped in some kind of false teaching, is to remember God's love for them and
Yes.
remember your love for them, and put that first in your thought as you're approaching them personally. It's a joyous thing to think about
Yeah.
the love of God. It's a joyful thing,
Yeah.
and to think, okay, I'm here to share this message because of God's love, because He wants to know you to know about it. He wants me to declare it to you. So He's put me in that role. So that makes me happy too. And yet, we've seen a lot of Christians who fake it. I mean, and they basically tell others to fake it. And I'm thinking particularly of maybe Don will click with this one too. The brightness of the eyes. So you had Bill Gothard with this brightness of the eyes teaching, and then they would do videos where I'll try to do the brightness of the eyes. This is the way they looked. They were like, yeah, it's like every time you saw them on a video, it was like they were forcing their eyes to be wider than the average person's eyes would be, because Bill Gothard had taught them that God wants them to have brightness of eyes as they
talk about how you proclaim the gospel, that you have bright eyes.
And it's like, yeah, that doesn't make you look happy. It makes you look weird.
Yeah. I would
makes you look like Adam Schiff is what happened.
Yeah, I would suggest that this is really something that's forced and unnatural, and with a wooden literalism.
I have a couple things. One is, as we're talking, I'm thinking of two funerals. This might sound a little weird, but maybe it exemplifies sort of what you're talking about. One is, we had a friend some years ago. She was Jewish and a non-believer, and she passed away. And so we went to the funeral, and it was terrible. Bring in the Clowns was the song they sang. They talked about her becoming a star in the sky, and we said, they have no hope. I mean, they have nothing to look forward to, and they are broken and devastated by this loss. And then recently, my friend Dr. Norman Geisler passed away, went to be with the Lord, and his funeral was a celebration of his life, of the people he touched. Yes, there is loss, but it's temporary, and they realize it's temporary. And they have, while they are having mourning of the temporary loss, they are having joy of all that God had done through him and comfort. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
Yeah, well, certainly in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul draws a distinction and a contrast between grieving with joy and grieving without joy.
Yep. Yeah.
And at the end of the apocalyptic teaching, Paul zeroes in on the joy vocabulary with the theme of mutual encouragement. And let me just say that really the heart of apocalyptic teaching is to be found in the exhortations, in the imperatives, and particularly in the language of encouragement. Certainly not the charts that people draw of the end times. That's not the focus.
But do the charts of the end times come into play at some point? I mean, depending on your theology, obviously. But as even as we're talking, I'm thinking about the question of what is the great commandment. And it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And I've recently been teaching on this a lot in churches as a kind of response to the question of homosexuality, where many of them who are advocating to embrace homosexuality in the church want to say, well, I really love what Jesus says about loving your neighbor as yourself. And I have to point out that that's the second part of a two-part statement in the story. The first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. The first one covers the first 4 of the 10 commandments, which I think are subheadings of what we find then later on, which explains how that works. The second covers the second 6. Now, love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, and all your soul. Does that mean that intellectual pursuits are part of the Christian life and experience and joy, emotions are part of the Christian life?
Yeah. I mean, the response of love embraces every aspect of a person's being. I'm not one who divides a human person up into parts, but I certainly see within the Bible that when various terms are used, like heart, they are expressing an aspect of a person's existence, but not to be expressed in partitive ways, as if the human person can be divided up into 3 parts or 4.
You know, I especially resonate with one. I like the chapter, the God of Emotion, because you basically you set forth a series of conclusions that I think we should draw from your study. And the one that kind of touches on what Don and you just discussed, I think if I could boil down what you're discussing, Don, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it's like we have propositional truth over here and emotion over here. And how do we connect the two?
Right. That's the question. Right.
And to me, it's like, wait a minute. When I found out that Jesus, okay, when I was a second grader, I asked the nuns, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? And they said, to open the gates of heaven. And I'm in my little second grade brain, I go, what? It's like, he was already up in heaven. Why couldn't he open the gates on the way down? And then he wouldn't have had to die on the cross. You know, it's like, wouldn't that have made, it's like, you know, he was already there. Just open them, you know? And I didn't understand. Later on, I did find out what that phrase meant. And in Catholic theology, what it means is Jesus opens the gates, and now it's all up to you to go through and get in through following the sacramental system. That was explained very clearly to me by a Roman Catholic who used the same exact phrase, open the gates of heaven. So I was struggling, and I came to the conclusion, I just don't get this Jesus stuff, this Christianity stuff, until one day, years later, about the same, you know, I was like 8 when I heard that. 8 years later, I'm about 16, and somebody says, have you accepted Christ as your Savior? And they handed me For Spiritual Laws tract, and then that tract it said he was my substitute. Now that's a propositional statement, okay? And they gave me Bible verses, but it clicked in my head. It was like, it makes sense, and my response was joy. So the proposition, if you apprehend it with faith and you apply it to yourself, you should be happy. I mean, unless the proposition is something like, you know, Jesus went out or Judas went out and hung himself, and go thou and do likewise, and or you know, unless you choose to apprehend all the verses about hell and just say I'm going to hell, well then you shouldn't be happy. But the Bible doesn't call you to believe those things. The Bible calls you to trust Christ, and to trust that He died as your substitute. And so, you know, I think what happened in a lot of Christian circles, and it did happen to some extent, especially in the 1600s after the Reformation was over, you had everybody divided up into camps, and they began crafting final confessional statements. So the Presbyterians had the Westminster Confession, which is what I adhere to, and then the Congregationalists took it and adapted it, and they took it and made it the Savoy Declaration. And then a few years later, the Baptists take it and they revise it again and make it the Second London Baptist Confession. And they're substantively the same confessions with different church polities, different modes of baptism. But it is somebody once said, oh, those are very dry and dusty confessions. And I said, okay, well, when you compare it to the Heidelberg, which begins by saying, what is your only hope in life? And he said, my only hope, it makes it very personal, that God loves me, that He's never going to let anything bad happen to me, that ultimately, for my everything, even bad things, are for my ultimate good. When you read that first paragraph of the Heidelberg Catechism, you're pulled in personally in a way that you're not with those later ones, because by that time, you have the battle has moved from the parish to the university.
All right.
And in the parish level, you have to be pastoral. At the university level, you have to be academic. And so, but when I read the Westminster or the Savoy or the Baptist, I think, wow, these truths are real. They apply to me. And even though they're not stating it in a personal, first-person way, it's about me. Yeah. And I have to do a little extra work to realize Christ's righteousness is imputed to me for my justification and say, wow, that is an amazing truth. And then I rejoice.
Yeah, the propositional truth is to lead to a human response. For
Amen.
example, the very fact of the inestimable worth of each person
Yeah.
is stated in both testaments.
Hmm.
Whether it's in the reaffirmation and the creation narrative of being created in the image and likeness of God twice, or in Paul's statement, a brother or sister for whom Christ died, that makes human beings possess inestimable worth.
Mm-hmm.
And when they get a hold of that, really, and make it to, their own, it leads to a response of tremendous joy.
Hmm. Yeah. When it's your truth, to borrow a postmodern phrase, when you make it your truth, now I'm not using it in the postmodern sense. I believe all truth is always true, and it's not just relative to the person. But when you appropriate it for yourself, when you say,
Yeah.
yes, I'm going to believe this, how can you not have joy? And I'm particularly focusing on that in chapter 10, the God of Emotions, your 10th enumerated paragraph here, where you say something, and as I'm reading it, I'm saying, yeah, but we miss it. As we're reading it with eyes that aren't looking for it. You write this: Luke doesn't only narrate stories, but he intends to draw his readership into the joyful expressions, experiences, and atmosphere. In a vicarious way, Luke invites his readers to share experiences with attendant joy, not only in a personal way, but in a communal context. So in other words, we're reading this together in the early church, and as I'm hearing it being read or reading it along with others, if I have a copy of it, I'm reading about these experiences that these early disciples had that caused them to erupt in spontaneous joy. And Luke wants me to have the same experience, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Luke wants to pull his readers into the experience. He is not simply writing facts one after the other of events.
Yeah, and we, of course, now you got to, okay, right, you got to do your exegesis, right? You got to parse the verbs, decline nouns,
Sure.
mainly parse the verbs. And you got to do all that, and it's almost like, but the way we do it though, we're keeping the text at arm's length. But you can do all that while saying, every time I parse a verb, every time I decline a noun, every time I look at the structure and the context, I need to remember this is for me. This is for us. And
Yeah.
if I'm going to share it, I need to make sure the people I share it with know what you just wrote here, that Luke wants you to be rejoicing. He wants you to feel it.
Yeah.
He wants
He,
you to
he wants you to engage with the story,
right. He wants you to engage
not just do an intellectual exercise about what
right.
happened, but to engage with the story.
He wants you
Yeah.
to think about it, but
He invites and he seeks to elicit something from his readers. The gospel writers are not simply historical reporters of events, but they want to draw their readers into an experience for themselves as well as their faith communities.
right.
And certainly the experience of joy is uppermost.
So we're taught in higher education that there's something called analysis, and we're taught that there's something called synthesis. Those words have kind of fallen out of vogue, but at least I was taught about them. Analysis, if you looked at how to analyze, let's say, a frog, if you would get out your dissection tools and cut it up, and you would, and a lot of people have complained, well, analysis kills things. And I go, well, yeah, you're right. Especially if it's biological, it tends to, unless you can dissect something without killing it. But then there's synthesis. So I take this living thing, the Word of God, which the Bible calls living, powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword, and I analyze it. But how do you analyze it without killing it? Well, by following the next step of synthesizing it. What do you mean by that? Well, first of all, getting the context, synthesizing it with what does it mean in the context, and then what does it mean to me?
Yeah.
Synthesize it with myself, because the Bible always intends you to apply it to yourself, to connect it to yourself.
And I would extend that. It's not simply personal, but the Semitic world is distinctly communal.
Mhm.
And it is to be an experience that is shared by a community. For example, the fruit of the Spirit that Paul mentions in Galatians 5 are not simply privatized Christian emotions, but they are emotions that are expressed in the context of others, in a community, and in relationship.
Yeah, you can't live the Christian life on your own. You
Yes.
really can't. You
Okay,
can't
now-
live it. Yeah.
Now, for those, by the way, it's about time. We want to talk about what we're talking about, which is Dr. Lyle Story, his book Joyous Encounters, Discovering the Happy Affections in Luke Acts. He also is the instructor at greek2me.biz. So you can go there if you want to learn biblical Greek. He's got a fine little course I really recommend, and I'm working through myself as well. And he also teaches at Regent University. So he's kind of a busy guy, and we're glad to have him on here. And Ron is going to talk about something.
Something about something. Yeah. Questions, more questions. We're loaded with questions today. Do you find yourself that you're fighting? Excuse me. Do you struggle with finding the right wine to bring to pagan goat sacrifices? Do you wonder what to wear to your neighbor's neo-Nazi parties? Do you get anxiety attacks when trying to find the right picket sign to share with your friends from Westboro Baptist Church? Well, now you can put an end to all the worries that come from trying to fit in with people on opposing sides of the culture wars, because you can find the perfect gift for any ideology at the Coexist Boutique. This week's special deal in honor of the 50th anniversary of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. Relive the days when university students subjected their professors to public shaming sessions in which they would break their eyeglasses and publicly rebuke them at great length for not exhibiting politically correct opinions and behaviors. Oh, wait, that's going on right now, right here in the USA. Well, this week's special deal in honor of that anniversary is Cultural Revolution Eyewear, genuine smashed Chinese prescription lenses and frames formerly owned by PhDs and university administrators, dating back from 1966 to 1976. You know, the years of the Cultural Revolution. Only 99 cents a pair at the Coexist Boutique. And for when you care enough to take your hands off your loved one's throats long enough to pick out the perfect gift. Why should having totally opposite worldviews where we believe in the destruction of the other side get involved?
Interfere with a good celebration.
Right, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And that's especially, we have Thanksgiving coming up, and you'll have families gathered around tables, and so now you have a place to go to get the right kind of gift.
I hear so many stories of how difficult that is when you're like, you have Republicans and Democrats at the same Thanksgiving table. I'm not kidding. I've heard how it's. You got to go to that Coexist Boutique and pick something up.
There you go. Or there's a better option, and that is joy. If we can make our joy full, and how would that be accomplished? As you're going through the book, and Ron, I'm taking you really do recommend the book.
I do very hard. I like it. It's just I have not seen anything like this anywhere else. You know, I've not seen this study of this particular topic. Now, you talk about other scholars who have dealt with it, but I don't remember that any of them dealt at a book length with this. Would you say, as far as you know, you're the first?
Yeah, I would say more recently the topic of emotion has come to the fore.
Okay.
And is increasingly becoming important.
But this is a unique contribution, so focusing on, I think, a very neglected emotion, and in an author that I wouldn't have thought of first. He's not the author. Luke would not have been, if you just queried me at random, since I hadn't given a lot of thought to it. I probably would have said, well, you got Philippians, you've got statements in the Johannine writings. But when you brought this out, it's like, wow, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Luke is covering a period of 60 years in the 2 volumes. And from the very beginning to the end, his message is that of a fully inclusive and exuberant joy for the people of God, both individually and also corporately.
And as I mentioned earlier, this is an apologetics issue too. And we don't know who this Theophilus guy was. The name means lover of God, but he might not have been a believer yet. I don't know. In other words, or maybe he was a new Christian who needed to know the facts of the gospel in the early church. And Paul or Luke intends for him to be attracted by that element of joy. If we assume he's a real person, some people imagine that maybe he's just a general term for the recipients of his work. I don't know, but he addresses them personally.
Yeah, well, perhaps Theophilus is the one who is funding the effort of writing.
Yeah, then he would have to be a real person, because imaginary people don't tend to give you money.
But you could imagine that they would, but
I give you imaginary money.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Which brings out the fact that writing was an expensive undertaking. Right?
It was.
Writing and publishing was very expensive. Back in the days when it was parchment and carefully written with ink,
And it needed a
patron.
A patron, certainly.
Yeah. All right.
So the story, I'm kind of intrigued by this idea of bringing you into the story, because although I guess I do that to some degree. Even as you're describing it, I think of films. For me, it's films. It can be books, but I think of Schindler's List, for example, and it is a gripping, compelling story. It's a true story, and as you watch the story unfold, Saving Private Ryan is the same kind of a thing. As you watch the story unfold, you get information along the way, but you also engage in the emotions of the characters.
Yes.
That you identify with. And you're basically, what you're saying is, in Luke Acts, as you read that, it is more than just an intellectual exercise by which we derive doctrine, but it is a story designed to get you engaged with the experiences of the characters.
Well, I think all narrative prose, if it's seeking to be successful as literature, I don't know how else to put this, it has to present characters that you care about.
Yeah.
If you don't care about them, you're probably going to lose interest in the story after a short time. I had a hard time finally realizing that, but just in terms of understanding, why do people read fiction? I mean, I can understand why people read nonfiction, and I didn't realize, well, the reason, Ron, that you really like reading history and narrative prose about things that actually happen, is because you care about those topics, those people. The fiction writer has the additional challenge of getting you to care about people who don't really exist. So, but still, even in nonfiction narrative, you have to set a stage and make it so. These are people that you need to care about.
Yeah.
I certainly would echo that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we are nearing the end of our time together, not on this planet, but just on this show.
Oh. All right.
I know Ron was concerned about that.
I'd be breaking out in sweats there for a minute.
We are talking with Dr. Lyle Story. Let's see if I can get this up here and going again quickly. I can't do anything quickly today.
Joyous Encounters.
Screen share. Here we go. Bing, bing, bing. We are talking about his book, Joyous Encounters, Discovering the Happy Affections in Luke Acts. And again, you could go to his website, greektome.biz, and sign up. And take his Greek course on New Testament Greek.
And
I would give you a code to get a discount, but I don't recall if we have one still.
Yep, this came out last year, so it's a relatively new book still, very new really, and it's highly recommended. We highly recommend it.
You highly recommend it. So that is the source.
All right.
All right.
Well, thanks so much.
Just for those who might be interested, next week we have Al Stewart. I was a pastor. He's been a defender of the faith for 30 years, probably 35 years. And the topic we're doing is pastors, former cult members, and the church. How do those who have been involved in false teaching transition into the church? What does a pastor need to know to do that? Because a lot of pastors are just not equipped to deal with former cult members, as many churches aren't really, unfortunately. So that's one. And for those who are interested, we are doing a debate. It'll be the first time we've done this on December 3rd. So we won't have our full commercials on there because we're going to be dealing with a little bit different webcast. We'll have a Muslim and a Christian on, and they're debating the question of the God, is God Allah or Yahweh? So that'll be interesting. And both of them are scholars in South Africa. So that will be interesting. Ron, would you care to walk us out of here?
I just care to do that. Yeah. So our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services come from Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys is O.D. Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes from Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Yvonne Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping, and our original idea sourcing comes from Drew Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never. Dr. Story, we are glad to have you on, and I'm sure at some point in the future we will recruit you to be further abused just because we like to do that.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a delight for me.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. And to everyone else, see you next week.